Welcome to Story Tales. Please like this video and subscribe to Story Tales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. The fluorescent lights in Dr. Martinez's office buzzed like angry wasps. Cass Rourke sat in the plastic chair, his 10-year-old son Ari fidgeting beside him, still wearing the hospital gown that made him look smaller than he was. The blood work confirms it, Dr. Martinez said, her voice steady but gentle. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Aggressive form. Cass felt the words hit him, but didn't let his face change. Ari was watching him, those dark eyes searching for any crack in his father's expression. Cass had learned long ago that kids could smell fear like smoke. What's that mean? Ari asked. It means you're sick, buddy, Cass said. But we're going to fight it. Dr. Martinez spread papers across her desk. Treatment starts immediately. Chemotherapy, possible radiation. The good news is that children respond well to treatment when we catch it early. Early? Cass asked. We'll know more after the bone marrow biopsy next week. The survival rates are encouraging, Mr. Rourke. 80% for children Ari's age. 80%, which meant 20% didn't make it. Cass pushed that number down deep where Ari couldn't see it. How long? Cass asked. Minimum 2 years of treatment. Possibly 3. He'll need to be here 3 days a week initially. Then we'll adjust based on how he responds. 3 days a week. Cass did the math in his head. Gas, parking, lost work time. His freelance writing barely covered rent, as it was. He had 6-year-old Jude and 4-year-old Leona at home with a neighbor's teenage daughter, paying her $20 he couldn't spare. Insurance will cover most of the treatment, Dr. Martinez continued. But there will be gaps, and he'll need someone with him during the sessions. I'll be here, Cass said. Dad, Ari tugged on his sleeve. Am I going to die? The question hung in the air like a blade. Cass looked down at his son, this small person who trusted him to have answers, to fix things, to be the wall that held back the world's cruelty. No, Cass said. You're going to fight this, and I'm going to be right beside you. That's what we do, remember? We don't quit. Ari nodded, his shoulders straightening a little. We don't quit. That's right. But driving home, Cass gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. In the rearview mirror, he watched Ari stare out the window at the Seattle skyline, the space needle-sharp against gray clouds. His boy was trying to be brave, and that broke something in Cass's chest. His phone buzzed against the dashboard. A text from his editor at the lifestyle blog. Where's the piece on sustainable living? Deadline was yesterday. Cass had forgotten. Completely forgotten. The article sat half-finished on his laptop, abandoned when he'd rushed Ari to the emergency room 2 days ago after the kid collapsed during soccer practice. He home. Jude and Leona crashed into his legs before he made it through the front door. Is Ari okay? Jude asked. At 6, he understood that hospitals meant serious things. He's going to be fine, Cass said, lifting Leona onto his hip. But he's got to take some medicine that might make him tired for a while. Like when I had strep throat. Leona asked. Something like that. Emma, the neighbor's daughter, gathered her backpack from the couch. They were really good. Jude helped Leona with her blocks. Cass paid her from the emergency $20 he kept taped under the kitchen drawer. $20 that should have gone toward groceries. After she left, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, trying to finish the sustainable living piece while the kids ate grilled cheese sandwiches. 10 ways to reduce your carbon footprint, he typed. Number 7, buy local produce. The irony wasn't lost on him. He bought the cheese at the gas station because it was 2 blocks away and he didn't have gas money to drive to the grocery store. His phone rang. Unknown number. Mr. Rourke? This is Jennifer from Seattle Children's Hospital. We need to schedule Ari's bone marrow biopsy. Okay, how's Monday at 9 a.m.? Monday. He had a client call at 10, a potential contract worth $800. Can we do Tuesday? I'm sorry, but Dr. Martinez only does procedures on Mondays and Fridays. And we want to get this scheduled as soon as possible. Monday's fine. He hung up and stared at his laptop screen. $800. Gone. He opened his bank account on another tab. Balance, $147.23. Rent was due in 2 weeks. Ari wandered into the kitchen, still pale from the hospital visit. Dad, can I have some juice? Sure, buddy. Cass poured apple juice from a container that was more water than juice at this point. Ari didn't complain. He never complained about anything. This kid who was facing a 2-year battle with cancer and didn't even know what that really meant yet. That night, after the kids were asleep, Cass sat on his fire escape, smoking a cigarette he'd bummed from the downstairs neighbor. The habit he quit 3 years ago crept back like muscle memory. Seattle spread out below him. All those lights in all those windows. All those families dealing with their own problems that probably didn't include watching their 10-year-old fight for his life that he thought about his parents. Wallace and Irene Rourke, who lived 40 minutes away in Bellevue and hadn't spoken to him in 3 years. Not since he'd told them he was done with their church, done pretending to believe things that made no sense to him, done raising his kids in an environment that taught them they were broken from birth. The fight had been brutal. Wallace had quoted scripture about rebellious children. Irene had cried and said he was destroying his family's eternal souls. They told him not to come back until he was ready to repent. Well, maybe now they'd help. Maybe a dying grandson would crack through their righteous anger. And then there was Marla, his ex-wife, who'd left when Leona was 2 because she said being married to a struggling writer was beneath her potential. Marla, who now lived in a downtown condo and worked in pharmaceutical sales, making more in a month than Cass made in 6, that she sent child support checks that barely covered daycare. She saw the kids every other weekend when it was convenient, which was maybe twice a month. But she had money. She had connections. She could help. Maybe this crisis would remind her that these were her children too. Cass flicked the cigarette into the alley and went inside. Tomorrow he'd make the calls. Tonight, he'd sit in Ari's room and watch his son sleep, memorizing the way his chest rose and fell, the way his dark hair stuck up in the back, the way his face looked peaceful when he wasn't worried about things 10-year-olds shouldn't have to worry about. The phone rang 4 times before Wallace answered. Yes. No hello. No warmth. Just that cold, flat tone that meant Cass was interrupting something important. Dad, it's me. Silence. Then, what do you want, Cashin? Cass closed his eyes. He was standing in the hospital parking lot, watching Ari through the window of the pediatric oncology ward as nurses prepared him for his first round of chemotherapy. 2 weeks had passed since the diagnosis, and Cass hadn't slept more than 3 hours straight since then. Ari's sick, Cass said. Really sick. Leukemia. More silence. Not the shocked silence of someone processing terrible news. The deliberate silence of someone deciding how much they cared. I see, Wallace finally said. I need help. I can't be at the hospital 3 days a week and work enough to keep the rent paid. Jude and Leona need someone to watch them when I'm here with Ari. And you thought of us. You're their grandparents. Wallace made a sound that might have been a laugh. We're nothing to those children, Cashin. You made that clear when you chose to abandon your faith and poison their minds against God's word. Cass felt heat rise in his chest. This isn't about religion, Dad. This is about your grandson fighting cancer. This is about consequences. You rejected God's plan for your family. You married outside the faith. You refused to raise those children properly. And now you come crawling back when you need something. He's 10 years old. And whose fault is that? You think sickness comes from nowhere. You think God doesn't have a purpose in everything. The words hit Cass like cold water. Are you saying God gave my son cancer? I'm saying you reap what you sow. You want our help? Get on your knees and repent. Come back to the church. Raise those children the way they should be raised. Maybe then we can talk. Go to hell, Cass said, and hung up. His hands were shaking. Through the window, he could see Ari waving at him from the hospital bed, for tubes taped to his small arm. The kid was trying to smile, trying to be brave for his dad. Cass called Marla. This better be important, she answered. I'm in a meeting. Ari has leukemia. Pause. Then what? Cancer. He's been in treatment for 2 weeks. I've been trying to handle it alone, but I can't. I need help with the other kids when I'm at the hospital. Jesus, Cass, why didn't you call me sooner? For a moment, hope flickered in his chest. Maybe she'd step up. Maybe this would wake up whatever maternal instinct she'd buried under her career ambitions. Can you take Jude and Leona a couple days a week? Just while I'm here with Ari. Take them where? To my condo? Cass, I have a life. I have clients. I can't just drop everything because you can't manage your responsibilities. Our responsibilities. They're your kids too, are they? Because the way I remember it, you wanted full custody. You said you could handle it. You said you didn't need me interfering. That was different. That was divorce stuff. This is our son dying. Don't be dramatic. Kids beat cancer all the time now. The survival rates are like 90%, 80%, and that means 20% don't make it. You always were a glass half empty person. Look, I'll send you some money for a babysitter or something, but I can't rearrange my entire life for this. I got a promotion coming up. This is a crucial time for me. Cass stared through the hospital window at his son, who was now reading a comic book while poison dripped into his veins. A crucial time for you. Yes. And frankly, this feels like you weaponizing sympathy to get me more involved than our custody agreement requires. You're a broke writer, Cass. You chose that life. Figure it out. The line went dead. Cass stood in the parking lot for 5 minutes, watching cars come and go, watching other families walk through the hospital doors carrying flowers and balloons and hope. None of them looked like they were carrying this weight alone. He went back inside. Ari looked up from his comic book. Was that Grandpa and Grandma? Ari asked. Yeah. Are they coming to visit? Cass sat down in the chair beside the bed. They're pretty busy right now, buddy. Oh. Ari turned back to his comic book. That's okay. We don't need them anyway, right? We got this. Yeah, Cass said. We got this. But the bills were piling up. He'd missed 3 client deadlines. The neighbor's daughter couldn't babysit as much as he needed because she had school. Jude had started wetting the bed again, and Leona kept asking why Ari was always tired. That night, Cass pawned his laptop. The pawn shop owner, a thin man with yellowed teeth, offered him $200 for a machine that had cost him $800. It's got all my work on it, Cass said. Back up everything first, the man suggested. You got 30 days to buy it back. Cass backed up his files to a thumb drive and handed over the laptop. $200 would cover gas and parking for 2 weeks, maybe 3 if he was careful that he bought a used Chromebook for $50 from a college student on Craigslist. The screen flickered and the keyboard stuck, but it connected to the internet. He could write on it, barely. Back at the hospital the next day, he sat in the family lounge typing on the broken Chromebook while Ari slept through his treatment. The article was about vacation rental properties in the San Juan Islands. Places that cost more per night than Cass made in a month. Escape to luxury, he wrote. Find your perfect getaway. A nurse walked by and glanced at his screen. Planning a vacation? Writing about one, Cass said. That's nice. Everyone needs a break. He wanted to laugh. When was the last time he'd taken a break? When was the last time he'd done anything that wasn't about keeping his family afloat or trying to save his son's life? His phone buzzed. A text from his landlord. Rent is 3 days late. Need payment by Friday, or we start eviction proceedings. 3 days late. He'd been so focused on Ari's treatment schedule that he'd lost track of everything else. The rent money was supposed to come from the San Juan Islands article, but he couldn't finish it because the Chromebook kept freezing every 10 minutes. Cass closed his eyes and tried to think. He could sell his car, but then how would he get Ari to treatments? He could ask his landlord for an extension, but the man had already given him 2 extensions this year. He opened his eyes and looked at his son, pale and thin in the hospital bed, fighting a battle he didn't choose. Ari deserved better than this. He deserved a father who could afford his treatment without choosing between rent and medicine. He deserved grandparents who loved him enough to help. He deserved a mother who put his needs before her promotion. But this was what Ari had. A broke father with a broken laptop and a breaking heart, trying to hold everything together with determination and borrowed time. Cass went back to typing on the flickering screen. 1 word at a time, 1 sentence at a time, 1 day at a time, because that's what they did. They didn't quit. 6 months later, Ari died on a Tuesday morning at 4:17 a.m. Cass had been sleeping in the chair beside the hospital bed when the monitors started beeping. Not the usual beeping he'd learned to ignore, but something urgent and wrong. Ari's breathing had turned shallow during the night, his fever spiking despite the medications. Dad, Ari whispered. Cass was instantly awake. I'm here, buddy. I can't. It's hard to breathe. The nurses came first, then Dr. Martinez, then other doctors whose names Cass never learned. They worked around him while he held Ari's hand, speaking in medical terms that meant nothing and everything. "Mr. Rourke," Dr. Martinez said gently, "would you like us to call anyone?" Cass looked at his son, this brave boy who had fought every day for 6 months, who had never complained when the chemotherapy made him sick, who had lost his hair and his appetite, but never his spirit. Ari's eyes were closing, his grip on Cass's hand getting weaker. "No," Cass said. "It's just us." They'd been alone through all of it. The weeks of treatment, the false hopes when his numbers improved, the crushing setbacks when new scans showed the cancer spreading. Through it all, it had been just the two of them in this room, fighting a war they couldn't win. "I love you, Dad," Ari whispered. "I love you too, kiddo. So much. Will you tell Jude and Leona I'll watch out for them?" Cass's throat closed up. "Yeah, I'll tell them. And Dad, don't be sad all the time, okay? You still got them to take care of." Those are the last words Ari spoke. He closed his eyes, and his breathing slowed, then stopped. The monitors went flat. Dr. Martinez checked for a pulse, checked her watch, and said the words that made it official. Cass sat there for an hour after the nurses left, holding his son's hand, memorizing his face. The freckles across his nose. The scar on his chin from when he fell off his bike 2 years ago. The way his eyelashes looked too long for a boy. Finally, he kissed Ari's forehead and walked out of the hospital. He drove home in silence. Jude and Leona were still asleep. The babysitter, Emma's older sister, was on the couch with textbooks spread around her. "How is he?" she asked. "He's gone," Cass said. She started crying immediately. Cass paid her and asked her to leave. He sat on his couch in the dark apartment and stared at the wall. Jude and Leona would wake up in a few hours expecting breakfast. They'd ask about their brother. He'd have to find words to explain why Ari wasn't coming home. His phone buzzed with a text from his editor. "Still need that revision on the Seattle restaurant piece. Can you have it by noon?" Cass stared at the message. Ari was dead, and someone wanted him to write about farm-to-table dining. He deleted the text without responding. The apartment was too quiet. For 6 months, there had always been something happening. Medical appointments, treatments, phone calls with doctors. Now, there was just silence and the knowledge that his son was gone. He opened his laptop. He'd managed to buy it back from the pawn shop a month ago and stared at the blank document. He should write something. A memorial post for social media. An obituary for the newspaper. Something to mark that Ari Rourke had existed, had mattered, had been loved. Instead, he opened a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for when Ari got better. The bottle he'd planned to share with his son when the kid turned 18, a toast to beating the odds. WY noon. The bottle was half empty, and Cass was thinking about the pills in his medicine cabinet. Leftover painkillers from when he'd hurt his back moving furniture. He'd saved them because prescriptions were expensive, but now they seemed like a solution to a different kind of pain. The kids were still sleeping. Jude and Leona, who'd been staying with Emma's family for the past 3 days while Ari was in the ICU. They'd come home this afternoon expecting their brother to be with him. Cass walked to the bathroom and counted the pills. 15 of them. Probably enough. The kids would be okay with their mother, eventually. Marla would have to step up. She'd have to take responsibility. He dry swallowed 2 pills, then stopped. On the coffee table was Ari's journal. The nurses had given it to him along with the rest of Ari's belongings. A small notebook with a dragon on the cover that Ari had written in during his treatment. Cass had never read it. He'd respected his son's privacy even in the hospital. Now he opened it. The handwriting was shaky from medications, but the words were clear. Day 47. Dad looks tired today, but he's trying to hide it. He brought me new comic books and stayed until I fell asleep. I told him he could go home, but he said there's nowhere else he'd rather be. I think he's lying, but I like hearing it anyway. Day 63. The new medicine makes me throw up a lot. Dad holds the bowl and doesn't even make a face. Then he helps me brush my teeth and tells me stories about when he was a kid. He makes being sick seem not so scary. Day 89. Dad fell asleep in the chair again. The nurses keep telling him to go home and rest, but he won't leave me alone. I pretend to be asleep, so he'll sleep too. He talks in his sleep sometimes. He says please a lot. I think he's asking God to make me better. I hope God listens. Day 127. Dad doesn't break. Even when he's hurting, He's the wall. Jude and Leona are lucky to have him. I hope they remember that when I'm gone. I hope they remember that Dad doesn't quit, even when everything is falling apart. Cass closed the journal. His hands were shaking again, but not from the pills. From rage. Ari had known. His 10-year-old son had known he was dying and had spent his time worrying about everyone else. While his grandparents turned their backs and his mother made excuses, Ari had been thinking about his siblings, about his father, about everyone but himself. Cass looked at the pills in his palm. He thought about Jude and Leona waking up to find both their brother and their father gone. He thought about Wallace and Irene learning that their grandson and son had died on the same day, and how they'd probably find a way to make it about God's plan. He thought about Marla at her important meetings, getting the news that would force her to finally take responsibility for something. None of them had earned that escape. None of them deserved to have their guilt washed clean by his death. He walked to the kitchen sink and spit out the pills. Then he poured the rest down the drain that if he couldn't burn the pain out of himself, he'd burn the people who had fed it. He sat down at his laptop and started typing, "My son died this morning at 4:17 a.m. His name was Ari Rourke. He was 10 years old. He loved comic books and soccer and terrible jokes that made everyone groan. He died alone, except for me, because the people who should have been there decided their principles were more important than his life. This is their story. This is what they chose." The words came easier than they had in months. For the first time since Ari's diagnosis, Cass knew exactly what he wanted to say and who he wanted to say it to. He wrote until Jude and Leona came home. Then he held them while they cried and answered their questions as honestly as he could. Yes, Ari was gone. No, he wasn't coming back. Yes, they would be okay. That night, after the kids were asleep, he went back to writing. He had worked a 2.3 weeks after the funeral. Cass established a routine. Wake up at 5 a.m., coffee, and 2 hours of writing before the kids got up. Breakfast, get Jude ready for school, drop Leona at daycare. Write until pickup time. Dinner, homework help, bedtime stories. Then write until midnight. The schedule kept him moving. It kept his mind busy. It kept him from thinking too long about the empty bedroom down the hall. He'd published the first piece about Ari's death on Medium 2 days after the funeral. The Ones Who Left Us Behind was a raw, honest account of watching his son die, while family members who could have helped chose not to. He named no names, but anyone who knew him would recognize the story that 37 people read it the first day. By the end of the week, it had reached 300. Not viral by internet standards, but more response than anything he'd ever written. Most of the comments were supportive. People sharing their own stories of family abandonment, of fighting illness alone, of learning who really showed up when everything fell apart. A few were critical, saying he was airing private family business or using his son's death for attention, that he deleted those without reading them fully. The piece caught the attention of Zola Brink, a journalist whose work Cass had admired for years. She'd won awards in the 90s for investigative pieces about corporate corruption, then disappeared from mainstream media after a scandal involving a source's confidentiality. Now she ran writing workshops from a coffee shop in Capitol Hill. "Your essay made me cry," she said when she called him. "And I don't cry. Want to get coffee?" They met at Victrola on Pine Street. Zola was younger than he'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You write like you're angry," she said after ordering a double espresso. "I am angry." "Good. Angry writing cuts through bullshit better than anything else. But you're writing like someone who's venting, not someone who's building a case." Cass stirred his coffee. "What's the difference? Venting makes you feel better temporarily. Building a case makes your enemies feel worse permanently." She leaned forward. "You want to hurt the people who hurt you?" "Yes." "Then stop writing like a victim and start writing like a prosecutor. Documentation, not emotion. Facts, not feelings. Make them explain themselves in public." She suggested he compile everything. Email threads, phone records, text messages. Build a timeline of abandonment that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. "They'll say it's private family business," Zola warned. "They'll say you're exploiting grief for clicks. You need to be bulletproof." Cass spent the next month doing exactly that. He went through old emails, print screen text conversations, logged every phone call and interaction he'd had with his parents and ex-wife during Ari's illness. The pattern was clear and damning. Wallace and Irene had offered to pray for Ari, but refused any practical help. When Cass sent them updates about his son's condition, they responded with Bible verses about God's plan and eternal life. When he asked directly for help with Jude and Leona, Wallace wrote back, "This is your mess, Cashin. Don't come crawling now." Marla's responses were worse in their casual cruelty. When Cass told her Ari's cancer had spread to his liver, she replied, "That sucks. By the way, can you switch weekends this month? I have a work thing." When he asked her to take the kids for a few days during Ari's final week, she said, "You're just a broke writer. Figure it out. All of it documented. All of it saved. All of it ready to be shared." The second article took him 3 weeks to write. He titled it "When You Let a Child Die" to prove a point and published it as a long-form piece on Medium, then shared it on Reddit and Twitter. This one exploded. Within 24 hours, it had been shared over 10,000 times. Parenting blogs picked it up. Viral content aggregators featured it. People started tagging friends, adding their own stories of family betrayal and religious hypocrisy. The comments section became a war zone. Supporters called him brave for speaking truth about fair-weather family members. Critics called him bitter, manipulative, vindictive. Some questioned whether the screenshots were real. Cass answered every comment that questioned his evidence. He provided context, additional documentation, timestamps. He was methodical, calm, factual. He let his critics sound emotional while he sounded rational. On day 3, NPR called. "This is Janet Rodriguez from All Things Considered. We'd like to interview you about your essay on family abandonment during medical crises." Cass agreed immediately. The interview ran the following Tuesday during drive time. Janet's questions were thoughtful, giving him space to explain not just what happened, but why it mattered beyond his personal situation. "What you're describing speaks to a larger issue," Janet said. "The way American families handle crisis, the role of religious communities in supporting members, the responsibilities we have to each other." "Exactly," Cass said. "This isn't just about my family. It's about what happens when people choose ideology over compassion, when they use faith as an excuse for cruelty. Your parents, if they were listening, what would you want them to know?" Cass had prepared for this question. "I'd want them to know that their grandson died thinking they didn't love him. I'd want them to know that their principles cost them any relationship with their surviving grandchildren. And I'd want them to know that I'll never forgive them for that choice." The NPR piece brought even more attention. Suddenly, Cass was receiving interview requests from podcasts, parenting magazines, and online publications. The single father abandoned by his family became a symbol for anyone who'd been let down by people who were supposed to love them unconditionally. His inbox filled with stories from other parents fighting childhood illness alone, from LGBTQ plus kids cut off by religious families, from people struggling with addiction or mental illness whose families had chosen judgment over support. Somewhere in the middle of all this attention, Cass realized he'd become something he'd never intended to be, a voice for the abandoned, and his parents and ex-wife were watching it all happen. The backlash started 2 weeks after the NPR interview. First came the anonymous blog posts on religious websites. The dangers of public shame, when grief becomes gossip. A son's bitterness destroys a Christian family. They didn't mention Cass by name, but the details matched his story perfectly. Then came the Facebook posts from his extended family. Cousins and aunts sharing articles about forgiveness, about honoring parents, about not airing family business in public. His uncle posted a long status about how some people use tragedy to attack faith communities and how bitterness poisons the soul. Cass screenshot all of it. More documentation for the file he was building. But the real response came from Marla. She called him on a Thursday evening while he was helping Leona with a puzzle. "Are you out of your goddamn mind?" she said without preamble. "Hello to you too. Don't be cute. You mentioned me in that NPR interview. People are figuring out who I am. My boss asked me about it today. What did you tell him?" "I told him my bitter ex-husband was having a breakdown and dragging me into it, which is exactly what's happening." Cass set down the puzzle piece he'd been holding. Leona looked up at him with concern. "Daddy's just talking to Mommy," he told her. "Keep working on the puzzle." He walked into the kitchen, out of the kid's earshot. "You want to have this conversation?" he said. "Really? Because I have a lot more documentation than what I've shared so far." "You're threatening me?" "I'm informing you. About every text, every email, every voicemail, including the one where you said I was weaponizing sympathy and told me to figure it out while your son was dying." Silence. "Then, those were private conversations. Between us, sure. But there's nothing private about abandoning your children during a crisis. That's a public act with public consequences. I didn't abandon anyone. I sent money, $200 over 6 months, for a kid who needed full-time care. I had work obligations. You had 3 children. One of them was fighting for his life, and you had custody. You chose to be the primary parent." Cass felt the familiar rage building in his chest. "I chose to be a parent, period. You chose your career over your kids." "Again. Fuck you, Cass. I'm not going to be your villain in this little public therapy session you're having." "Then you shouldn't have acted like a villain." The line went dead. That weekend, Marla filed for emergency custody of Jude and Leona. The court papers arrived by courier on Monday morning. The petition claimed that Cass was exploiting his children's grief for public attention, that his mental instability made him an unfit guardian, and that his vendetta against family members created an unsafe environment for the surviving children. Cass read the filing twice, then called Mel Kinney. Mel was a neighbor from 2 buildings over, a semi-retired public defender who'd helped Cass with his original custody agreement. She was in her 60s, sharp as broken glass, and had raised 3 kids as a single mom while building her career. "This is bullshit," she said after reading the petition. "Pure retaliation. But we need to take it seriously." They spent the next week building Cass's defense. Character witnesses who could testify to his parenting abilities. Documentation of his consistent care for all 3 children throughout Ari's illness. Records showing that Jude and Leona had maintained perfect school attendance, regular pediatric checkups, and stable home routines even during the worst of the medical crisis. "She's going to argue that you're obsessed with revenge," Mel warned. "That this public campaign is more important to you than your kids' well-being." "It's not about revenge," Cass said. "It's about accountability." "What's the difference?" Cass thought about that. Revenge is personal. Accountability is public. Revenge makes me feel better. Accountability makes it harder for them to hurt other people. That's a good answer. Remember it for court. But Cass was already working on something bigger than court testimony. He'd been contacted by a podcast called Disowned, which focused on stories of family rejection and religious trauma. The host, a former evangelical minister named David Shunn, wanted to do a 3-part series on religious families who abandon children during crises. "Your story is powerful," David said during their pre-interview call. "But it's not unique. We're hearing from people all over the country who've been cut off by religious families for getting divorced, coming out as LGBTQ+, leaving the faith, marrying outside their religion. The pattern is always the same. Unconditional love with a very long list of conditions." Cass agreed to be the featured interview for the series. David was a skilled interviewer, asking probing questions that let Cass tell his story without leading him toward any particular conclusions. "Tell me about the last conversation you had with your father," David said. Cass had been saving this recording. Wallace had called him a week after Ari's death, supposedly to offer condolences. But the conversation had gone differently than expected. "I asked him if he was calling to apologize," Cass said, "for refusing to help, for choosing his principles over his grandson's life." "What did he say?" "He said, and I'm quoting here, 'If your son died, maybe you'll finally understand God's wrath. Maybe you'll stop blaming others for the consequences of your rebellion.'" The podcast interview room went completely silent. He said that about his grandson. David asked about his dead grandson to his grieving father. A week after the funeral, Cass had recorded that call. In Washington state, only one party needed to consent to recording, and he'd started recording all conversations with his family after Ari's diagnosis. The audio was clear, undeniable. "Do you still have that recording?" "Yes." "Would you be willing to share it?" "Yes." The Disowned series premiered on a Tuesday in October. By Thursday, clips from Cass's interview were being shared across social media. The audio of Wallace's call was particularly viral, with people expressing shock at the cruelty of a grandfather blaming God's wrath for his grandson's death. Within a week, the series had been downloaded over 1 million times. News outlets started picking up the story. The Seattle Times ran a piece about local religious communities and family abandonment. Wallace's church was named in several articles. And that's when everything changed. The phone call started on Friday. First, reporters wanting statements from Wallace and Irene. Then, members of their church congregation asking questions. Then, according to Cass's sources, church leadership demanding explanations. Evergreen Community Church had built its reputation on family values and Christian compassion. Wallace had been a deacon for 15 years. Irene ran the women's ministry. They were pillars of their community, known for their dedication to traditional marriage and biblical parenting. Now they were the grandparents who had let their grandson die alone rather than compromise their religious principles. The church's damage control was swift and brutal. By Sunday, Wallace had been asked to step down from his leadership position to focus on family healing. By Tuesday, the women's ministry had restructured its leadership, removing Irene from her role. Cass learned all this from Emma's mother, who attended a sister church in the same denomination. Word traveled fast in evangelical circles, especially scandalous word about fallen leaders. "They're saying it's a misunderstanding," Emma's mom told him. "They are twisting things to make them look bad. Are they saying the recordings are fake?" "No, they can't. But they're saying there's more to the story, that you're not telling the whole truth." That gave Cass an idea. He spent the next week going through everything. Not just emails and texts from Ari's illness, but years of family correspondence. The gradual deterioration of his relationship with his parents after he left their church. The conditional love disguised as concern for his eternal soul. Then he created a timeline, a complete chronological record of every interaction he'd had with Wallace and Irene from the time he told them he was leaving their faith until the day Ari died. Email by email, text by text, phone call by phone call. He published it as a Google document and shared the link on social media. 23 pages of documentation showing exactly how a religious family systematically cut off a son and his children, culminating in their refusal to help during a medical crisis. The timeline was devastating in its mundane cruelty. Wallace quoting scripture about rebellious children when Cass asked for parenting advice. Irene sending religious books instead of birthday presents for the grandchildren. Both parents refusing to attend Christmas dinner because Cass wouldn't say grace. And then, during the worst crisis of their family's life, complete silence except for demands that Cass repent as a condition for their help. The Google Doc was shared thousands of times. Religious trauma support groups used it as an example of spiritual abuse. Family therapists referenced it in articles about conditional love and emotional manipulation. But the real impact came when Wallace's church started hemorrhaging members. The story had made local news, and suddenly everyone knew that Evergreen Community Church was the place where leadership let children die to prove theological points. Young families started leaving. The Sunday school enrollment dropped by half. Several major donors pulled their support. Within a month, Evergreen was facing a financial crisis. The building mortgage was in jeopardy. Staff positions were eliminated. The senior pastor announced his resignation to pursue other ministry opportunities. Wallace and Irene became pariahs in their own community. The people who had once praised their biblical commitment now whispered about their heartless treatment of their dying grandson. They stopped attending church services. They stopped participating in community events. They effectively disappeared from the public life they'd spent decades building. And then Cass got the call from the publisher. "This is Jennifer March from Cascade Books. We're interested in your story." She'd heard the podcast, read his essays, followed the social media documentation. She wanted him to write a book about the whole experience, from Ari's diagnosis to his family's abandonment to the public reckoning that followed. "We're thinking a memoir that also examines larger issues," she said. "Religious trauma, family dynamics, the responsibility we have to vulnerable members of our community. Your story is specific, but the themes are universal." The advance was more money than Cass had seen in years. Not enough to make him rich, but enough to pay off medical bills, catch up on rent, and maybe even take Jude and Leona somewhere nice for a weekend. What would you want to call it? Jennifer asked. Cass thought about Ari's journal, about the line that had saved his life in those dark moments after his son's death. What remains of the fire, he said. I love it. How soon can you have a proposal? The custody hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November. Cass arrived early, wearing his only suit and carrying a folder thick with documentation. Mel sat beside him at the plaintiff's table, reviewing her notes one final time. Marla entered with her attorney, a sharp-dressed woman from a downtown firm that specialized in family law. Marla looked polished and professional in a way that reminded everyone in the room that she had money and status. Her attorney looked like someone who charged $300 an hour. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Williams. Judge Williams was a thin woman in her 50s with graying hair and eyes that had seen every family lie possible. She'd been on the bench for 12 years, long enough to spot manipulation from both sides of any custody dispute. Ms. Voss, she said to Marla's attorney, this is your petition. Present your case. Marla's attorney painted a picture of a father consumed by grief and rage, using his children's tragedy to wage a public war against family members. She referenced his essays, his podcast interviews, his social media posts as evidence of obsessive behavior. Mr. Rourke has turned his son's death into a public spectacle, she argued. He's more interested in destroying reputations than healing his family. The surviving children are being raised in an environment of bitterness and revenge. She called character witnesses who testified about Cass's angry writings, his public attacks on the children's grandparents, his obsession with media attention. A child psychologist testified about the potential damage of exposing children to ongoing family conflict. When it was Mel's turn, she started with the basics. Your Honor, Mr. Rourke has been the primary caregiver for all 3 children since his divorce. During his son's illness, he maintained their school attendance, their medical care, their emotional stability, while simultaneously managing a complex medical crisis largely alone. She called Jude and Leona's pediatrician, who testified that both children were healthy, up-to-date on vaccinations, and showed no signs of neglect or emotional distress. She called their teachers, who described engaged, well-cared-for children whose father attended every conference and school event. But what about his public behavior? Judge Williams asked. The essays, the interviews, the social media campaign against the children's grandparents? Mel had prepared for this. Your Honor, Mr. Rourke documented a pattern of family abandonment during a medical crisis. Every piece of evidence he shared is factual and verifiable. The public response to that documentation says more about the actions he documented than about his decision to share them. Then she played the trump card. Video testimony from Dr. Martinez, who had treated Ari throughout his illness. In 15 years of pediatric oncology, Dr. Martinez said on the screen, I've never seen a more devoted father. Mr. Rourke was present for every treatment, every consultation, every difficult conversation. When other family members were absent, he provided both emotional and practical support that allowed Ari to focus on fighting his illness rather than wondering if he was loved. The doctor's testimony was devastating. Here was a medical professional with no stake in the custody dispute confirming that Cass had been an exemplary father during the worst crisis any parent could face. But Mel saved the best for last. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence of Ms. Voss's involvement with her children during the medical crisis. She introduced phone records showing that Marla had called Cass exactly twice during Ari's 6-month treatment. Text message threads where Cass updated her on their son's condition, and she responded with complaints about work stress or requests to change visitation schedules. Then came the recording of their conversation after Ari's death, where Marla accused Cass of weaponizing sympathy and told him to figure out as a broke writer. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Marla's attorney shuffling papers. Ms. Voss, Judge Williams said, You're asking this court to remove custody from a father who provided full-time care during his child's terminal illness and award it to a mother who was largely absent during that same period. On what grounds? Marla's attorney tried to redirect. Your Honor, Mr. Rourke's current behavior shows. Mr. Rourke's current behavior shows a father processing grief by seeking accountability from family members who abandoned him during crisis. I see no evidence that this behavior negatively impacts the surviving children. Judge Williams reviewed her notes for several minutes. The courtroom stayed silent. Petition denied, she finally said. Mr. Rourke retains sole legal and physical custody. Furthermore, I'm ordering a psychological evaluation for Ms. Voss before she files any future custody motions. This appears to be a retaliatory filing designed to silence protected speech, and this court will not tolerate the manipulation of children's welfare for personal vendettas. Marla's face went white. Her attorney whispered something urgent in her ear, but Marla shook her head and stood up. This is bullshit, she said loudly. He's poisoning those kids against their own family. Ms. Voss, Judge Williams said sharply, you're out of order. No, this whole thing is out of order. He gets to destroy people's lives and call it grief. Ms. Voss, sit down or you'll be held in contempt. Marla turned toward Cass. You think you won something here? You think this makes you a good father? You're just a bitter man with a dead kid and a keyboard. The courtroom erupted. Judge Williams banged her gavel. Marla's attorney tried to control her client. Mel put a restraining hand on Cass's arm as he started to stand. Ms. Voss, you are now in contempt of court. Bailiff, please escort her out. As Marla was led away, still shouting about Cass's vendetta, Judge Williams addressed the room. Let me be clear for the record. Mr. Rourke's documentation of family abandonment during a medical crisis is protected speech. His decision to share that documentation publicly does not constitute parental unfitness. If anything, the evidence shows remarkable strength and dedication during an unimaginable crisis. She looked directly at Cass. Mr. Rourke, I'm sorry for your loss. Your son was lucky to have a father who fought for him every day. Your surviving children are lucky to have that same father. Outside the courthouse, Mel lit a cigarette with shaking hands. 12 years of family law, she said, and I've never seen anything like that. She basically confessed to filing a retaliatory suit in front of a judge. Cass watched Marla's attorney walk past them without making eye contact. What happens now? Now you go home to your kids. And she goes home to explain to her boss why she's all over social media having a meltdown in family court. The meltdown video was already online. Someone in the courtroom had recorded Marla's outburst on their phone. By evening, it was trending on Twitter. #DeadKidKeyboard. Marla's words became a rallying cry for people who'd been abandoned by family during crises. Parents fighting childhood cancer alone started using the hashtag to share their stories. The phrase dead kid and a keyboard became shorthand for using truth to hold powerful people accountable. Cass never commented on the video. He didn't need to. Marla had destroyed herself more completely than any essay or interview ever could point 3 weeks after the custody hearing. Cass was going through old audio files on his computer when he found it. The recording was from a phone call Wallace had made a week after Ari's funeral. Cass had been recording all family conversations since the diagnosis, a habit that had started as documentation for medical decisions and evolved into protection against gaslighting. He'd listened to this particular call once, then buried it deep in his files because it was too painful to process. But now, sitting in his apartment with his publisher's contract on the table and his children asleep in their beds, he played it back. Wallace's voice came through the laptop speakers, cold and self-righteous. If your son died, maybe you'll finally understand God's wrath. Maybe you'll stop blaming others for the consequences of your rebellion. Cass stared at the audio file. His father, a week after his grandson's funeral, suggesting that God had killed a 10-year-old boy to teach the boy's father a lesson about faith. The Disown podcast series had brought national attention to religious family abandonment, but it had focused on patterns and systems rather than the most brutal individual moments. This recording was different. This was a grandfather explaining his dead grandson's cancer as divine punishment. Cass uploaded the audio file to SoundCloud and posted the link on Twitter with minimal commentary. My father, 1 week after my son's funeral, explaining why God killed his grandson. The response was immediate and volcanic. Within 6 hours, the tweet had been shared 15,000 times. Within 12 hours, it was trending nationwide. Within 24 hours, major news outlets were covering the story. The audio clip became a symbol of religious extremism taken to its cruelest conclusion. People who had never heard of Cass's story before were now listening to a grandfather blame God's wrath for his grandson's death, and they were horrified. Religious leaders distanced themselves from Wallace's statements. Progressive Christians used the clip as an example of how fundamentalism distorts faith into cruelty. Atheist groups shared it as evidence of religion's capacity for harm. The backlash reached Wallace's community within days that Emma's mother called with updates from the evangelical network. They're saying he's brought shame on the whole denomination. People are calling him a false teacher, saying he's perverted the gospel. By the end of the week, Wallace had been asked to step down from his deacon position. The church board released a statement saying his comments do not reflect our community's values of compassion and love. Irene faced her own consequences. The women's ministry she'd led for 12 years removed her from leadership. Former friends stopped speaking to her at grocery stores and community events. Their social media accounts filled with comment from strangers expressing disgust at their treatment of their dying grandson. Within 2 weeks, Wallace and Irene had become pariahs in the religious community they'd spent decades building. Their once-honored names were now synonymous with the worst kind of spiritual abuse, using faith to justify cruelty toward vulnerable children. The national attention brought something else. Publishers. Jennifer called on a Thursday morning with barely contained excitement. "Every major house in New York wants this book," she said. The audio clip changed everything. This isn't just a memoir anymore, it's a cultural moment. What does that mean in practical terms? It means we're talking about a 6-figure advance, maybe high 6 figures. And that's just the beginning. I'm getting calls about documentary rights, podcast deals, speaking engagements. 6 figures. The number felt surreal. A year ago, Cass had been pawning his laptop for gas money. Now publishers were competing to pay him more than he'd ever imagined having. "There's one condition," Jennifer continued. "They want the book fast. Strike while the story is hot. Can you have a full manuscript in 6 months?" "Yes." "Then congratulations. You're about to become very wealthy for telling the truth about very cruel people." That evening, Cass sat on his fire escape, smoking a cigarette and watching the Seattle skyline. His phone buzzed constantly with interview requests, social media notifications, messages from supporters and critics. The audio clip had done what months of essays and interviews couldn't. It had let people hear the actual voice of religious cruelty. Wallace's words, delivered in that familiar tone of righteous certainty, revealed the human cost of choosing principles over people. Cass thought about his father, probably sitting in his Bellevue home, watching his reputation crumble in real time. Wallace had spent decades building his image as a faithful Christian leader, and it had taken 30 seconds of audio to destroy it all. It was perfect justice delivered by Wallace's own words. Cass hadn't edited the recording or taken out of context. He'd simply let his father's voice reveal who he really was when his grandson's life was on the line. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I heard the recording of your father. I'm so sorry for what you went through. My religious family cut me off too, but never anything that cruel." Messages like that had been arriving all day. People sharing their own stories of religious abandonment, expressing gratitude that someone had finally put a voice to the cruelty they'd experienced from their own faithful families. Cass flicked his cigarette into the alley and went inside. He had a book to write, contracts to sign, and a future to build from the ashes of his family's destruction. They'd created their own consequences. He'd just provided the documentation. The book launch party was held at Elliott Bay Book Company on a rainy Thursday in March. Cass stood behind the podium, looking out at a crowd that included reporters, other writers, social media influencers, and dozens of people who'd been following his story since the first essay about Ari's death. What Remains of the Fire had been on the New York Times bestseller list for 3 weeks. The reviews called it devastating, essential, and a masterclass in accountability journalism. Sales were strong enough that the publisher was already talking about a second book. "Thank you all for being here," Cass said into the microphone. This book exists because my son Ari taught me that we don't quit, even when everything is falling apart. He taught me that the people who love you show up when it matters, and the people who don't show up don't get to call it love. The audience applauded. Cass saw familiar faces in the crowd: Mel, Dr. Martinez, Zola Brink, and his family. People who had actually shown up when things were difficult. Some people have asked me if I regret writing this book, if I regret sharing such personal family details publicly, if I regret the consequences my family members have faced. He paused, thinking about Wallace and Irene, who were currently facing criminal charges for embezzlement. About Marla, who'd been passed over for her promotion after the custody hearing video went viral and was now in mandatory anger management classes. I don't regret any of it. Truth has consequences. Cruelty has consequences. When you abandon a child during a medical crisis, when you steal money intended for sick families, when you choose principles over people, you create consequences. I just documented them. After the event, Cass signed books for an hour. People shared their own stories of family abandonment, of religious trauma, of learning who really showed up during hard times. Many thanked him for giving them language to describe their own experiences. As he was packing up, a familiar voice called his name. Cashin. He turned to see Wallace and Irene standing near the back of the store. They looked older, smaller somehow. The criminal charges and public shame had aged them visibly. What do you want? Cass asked. To talk, Wallace said. To explain. There's nothing to explain. Everything's already documented. Irene stepped forward. We know we made mistakes. We're sorry about Ari. We're sorry about the money. We want to make things right. With who? With me? With your dead grandson? With the other families your church stole from? With Jude and Leona? Wallace said. They're our grandchildren. They shouldn't have to pay for our mistakes. Cass looked at these two people who had once loomed so large in his life, who had raised him to believe in conditional love and righteous anger, who had taught him that principles mattered more than people, right up until their principles destroyed their own family. You think I'm keeping them from you? Cass asked. Aren't you? No, you are. You made a choice when Ari was sick. You chose your principles over your grandson's life. You chose your theology over your family. You chose to let a 10-year-old die, wondering why his grandparents didn't love him enough to help. We loved him, Irene said, tears starting. We loved all of you. No, you didn't. Love shows up. Love helps. Love puts people before principles. What you had was conditional approval disguised as love, and when I stopped meeting your conditions, you withdrew it. From me, from my children, from your dying grandson. Wallace's face hardened into the familiar expression of righteous anger. You're going to hold this grudge forever? You're going to poison those children against their own family. I'm not poisoning them against anyone. They're old enough to read. They're old enough to understand what happened when their brother was sick. They know who showed up and who didn't. They know who cared more about being right than being helpful. People can change, Irene said. People can repent. Good for them. But repentance doesn't erase consequences, and forgiveness doesn't restore trust. You abandoned me to suffer. You abandoned your grandson to die, and now you can live with the silence I lived with. Cass picked up his box of books and walked past them toward the door. Cashin, Wallace called after him. You're making a mistake. Family is all you have in the end. Cass stopped and turned back. No, Dad. Family is all you had. You chose to throw it away. I chose to protect what was left. He walked out into the Seattle rain, leaving them standing in the bookstore among the customers who just heard him read about their failures as grandparents and human beings. 6 months later, Cass finished setting up Jude and Leona's new bedrooms in the house he'd bought with his book royalties. 3 bedrooms, a backyard, a good school district. Everything he'd wanted to give them when they lived in the tiny apartment, and he was pawning his laptop for rent money. The Ari Fund had raised enough money to help 12 families deal with childhood illness while maintaining their housing and basic needs. Cass ran it from a small office downtown, staffed by volunteers who understood what it meant to fight alone. That he'd been contacted by several other publishers interested in his next book. Documentary filmmakers wanted to option his story. A streaming service was developing a limited series about religious trauma and family abandonment. But tonight, he was just a father helping his kids settle into their new home. Dad, Jude asked from his bed. Do you think Ari would like our new house? I think he'd love it, Cass said. Especially the big yard. He always wanted space to practice soccer. Maybe we could put up a goal for him. Like a memorial goal. I think that's a great idea. Leona appeared in the doorway in her pajamas. Can I sleep in Jude's room tonight? The new house makes different sounds. Of course. You can sleep wherever you feel safe. As he tucked them both into Jude's bed, Leona asked the question she'd been asking for months. Are Grandma and Grandpa ever going to visit us here? Casa prepared for this moment. He'd practiced giving them an honest answer that didn't burden them with adult anger. I don't think so, sweetheart. They made some choices that hurt our family, and sometimes when people hurt you that badly, you can't let them close enough to hurt you again. Even if they say sorry, even then, some hurts are too big for sorry to fix. That's sad, Leona said. It is sad, but it's also okay. We have each other, and we have people who really care about us. That's enough. Later, after the kids were asleep, Cass sat in his new living room and opened his laptop. He was working on the second book about the broader patterns of religious abuse and family manipulation that his story had uncovered. The research was difficult, the interviews emotionally draining, but felt important. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I read your book. My parents cut me off when I came out 5 years ago. Thank you for showing me that their silence says more about them than about me. Messages like that arrive daily now. People who'd been abandoned by religious families, by parents who chose ideology over love, by communities that preached unconditional acceptance while practicing conditional approval. Cass had become accidentally famous for refusing to forgive, for choosing accountability over reconciliation, for letting consequences stand instead of smoothing them over with false peace. In a culture that demanded forgiveness as a performance of virtue, he'd chosen truth as a form of justice. He opened a new document and began typing the dedication for the second book. For Ari, my first fire. For Jude and Leona, what I protect with its heat. For everyone who was told that love came with conditions, you deserved better. For everyone who chose truth over false peace. The silence is not your fault that he wasn't healed. He wasn't happy, but he was strong, respected, and never again powerless. And in the end, that was enough.